Hello and welcome to Ravlic at Large. My name's Tom Ravlic. Thank you for joining me for this particular episode. We're doing it via a different platform on this occasion. Technical difficulties have had us deal with it in another way. Housing will be a major issue in the federal election as we head closer to the Australian poll. We don't know when the Prime Minister is going to call it. He's got to call it sometime before the 17th of May this year. It could be at any time at all. But what is a constant, rather than when the Prime Minister calls an election, is the state of play in the housing market. There's been a lot of talk about the haves and the have-nots in the housing space and what needs to happen in order to get a housing, the infrastructure ready for housing out there to be able to cope with not only the demands that exist now, but also over a period of time as immigration numbers grow. Now, joining me, as you can see on screen, is KPMG's Terry Rawnsley. He's an urban economist who's going to help us navigate some of this today. Terry, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, Tom.
Now, before we dive into the before we dive into the topic that we're talking about, um, economists come in all different shapes, sizes, and colours, don't they? What's an urban economist? Well, how would you describe yourself to someone who has only just tripped over the term when they see a media release from KPMG?
Yeah, and my job is to sort of focus on how do big, mega economic trends, demographic trends impact place. So all these various factors, how do they impact on a particular place? Whether it's the housing that's there, the infrastructure, access to jobs, the economic structure. My job is to understand how will different places evolve over a time. So hence the urbans trying to give a sense of that built form.
Okay, so you're worried about the impact of a range of factors on place. Now, if we drop into the topic of a relatively recent media release, which I've had the opportunity to have a good look at, and that is the you've observed through looking at data that there is a change in the mix of who is investing in property
Mhm.
and who is investing in shares. What does the data tell us about the state of the marketplace today?
And that most recent analysis you're referring to there, Tom, was us looking at every year or so, the Bureau of Statistics does a household survey. So they go to a particular household and knock on the door and say, okay, who's living here? I'll ask you questions about your income and expenditure. And every couple of years, I'll ask you about your wealth. So they say, this particular household, how much does it have in superannuation or in shares, housing, how much debt do they have? And what we did sort of at the end of last year was look at the broad averages for those households. If it's headed up by someone as part of the boomer generation, someone headed at the X generation, and the Ys and the Zs. And sort of what was interesting of that analysis is we started to see a little bit of a changeover in terms of the wealth distribution on average between the boomers and the Xs. So we saw for the first time that the amount of average household housing wealth held by a boomer headed household drop below the X's for the first time. And what we're sort of seeing is the old demographic, the average baby boomer is about 69 years old. They're starting to do a couple of things. One is they might be starting to downsize. So they're going from the four-bedroom family house they've lived in for 30 years into a smaller townhouse. Or they're selling off the house and moving into aged care. So the boomers are slowly shifting out of the housing market, and the other thing we saw is they're sort of also de-risking their financial assets. So there's less money being held in shares, which can go up and down from month to month, hour to hour, and shifting that into cash. So they're sort of de-risking their portfolio. And the interesting sort of part of this dynamic is that when we look at the younger generations, the Ys and Zs, their sort of average household wealth and housing is much lower. And this is kind of leading us to this broader issue about access to home ownership. And Tom, over the past sort of 70 years, home ownership's been kind of the cornerstone of wealth accumulation. But what we're seeing is that with higher housing prices, the younger generations are finding it harder to get into the housing market. So when we sort of look at that boomer generation, when they were in their sort of late 20s, their home ownership rates is probably 10-ish percentage points higher than the same young people today. So we can see it's much more difficult to get into that housing market, which is creating all sorts of social and economic issues from that.
It's an interesting series of issues you've raised, and one of you know, and that's just the marketplace in Australia at the present time, right? What happens when we overlay the issue of immigration into that space?
Yeah, so and part of the challenge that we've got is that we've had a growing population almost related to that aging of the boomer cohort. So over the past 30 years or so, Australia's had below replacement rates of fertility. So, from a demographic point of view, to keep your population steady, you want each woman on average having 2.1 children. And over the sort of the last 30 or so years, Australia's kind of been below that 2.1. They've been sort of down around 1.8. During COVID, we kind of was sort of more of the 1.6. And over this long period of time, the sort of whole generation, it's created a bit of a gap in our labour force. So while the population's growing, our labour force, which is primarily focused on people aged say 20 to 64, that portion of the population hasn't grown through natural increase. So hence you need to rely more on international migration to bring in the various workers, whether it's aged care, service workers, finance insurance, IT programmers. You need to bring those into the country to sort of help service the existing population and deal with the increasing demand. And the challenge that we sort of faced over the past 20 years is our supply of housing hasn't kept up as much as we'd like with that increasing population. And it's not just sort of an aggregate number, it's also the distribution of where those households are. It's the type of housing there is. So we've had a really good run in Australia of producing a lot of 4 or 5 or 6 bedroom houses in our sort of green fields. You think about it in Melbourne, your Meltons, your Werribees. In Sydney, it's talking about Blacktown. In Brisbane, it's like your Logan, your Ripley Valley. We've been really good at producing lots of housing of that type. We've also been pretty good at producing sort of 1 and 2 bedroom apartments in the CBDs of Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane. Where we've kind of really lacked a bit of housing supply is in that sort of 2 or 3 bedroom middle ring suburbs, which kind of allows people to sort of go, okay, it's a 3 bedroom house. I can live there as a couple, I can have a child or two and grow the family there. So the housing market hasn't really provided enough of this sort of 2 or 3 bedroom middle ring housing. And the other thing that the Australian housing market hasn't done a very good job at is actually providing housing at the right price points for those various key workers.
Where do you, how do you navigate your way through that if you're a government that is in the sort of state of mind that we have at the moment, where
Mm.
people are having a conversation about a housing shortage?
Yeah, and this is where people talk about the Australian housing market, and for me, there isn't a single Australian housing market. There's probably 3 or 4 hundred housing markets across the country, and as I mentioned before, like some housing submarkets have kind of done a really good job unlocking housing at an affordable price point. But obviously, at the aggregate and across different price points, we've struggled. So for governments, it's starting to think about like what are the main barriers to providing more housing. So, in those greenfield areas, it's often the provision of or cost of the arterial road running through the greenfield. It might be the water and sewerage to unlock that housing estates. And various governments are trying to go, okay, we understand that we have this paddock on the fringe of our city which can provide housing, but we've got to somehow work out how to get the road in there. We need to have the local school built as soon as possible. So there's kind of an infrastructure story on those greenfields, whereas more about our middle ring suburbs, a lot of it is around the planning control, what's been permissible on sites. And historically, a lot of middle ring suburbs have had relatively low density. So it's basically a house, maybe a townhouse. And you've kind of seen various state governments, particularly in New South Wales and Victoria, coming in going, oh, well, look, we want more density. Let's change zoning from 2 stories to 20 stories, which, in ideal times would have unlocked more supply coming to the market. But what we've got at the moment is a real crunch in the commercial feasibility of high rise development. And what I mean by that is that since the onset of the pandemic, construction costs for high rises have sort of gone up by 50%. So costs of constructing something is up 50%, whereas the market's ability to pay for it is pretty much where it was pre-COVID. So you've got developers saying, oh, there's a bit of land that's been rezoned. I can build 20 stories, but when I do my sums, the cost of construction might be $1.2 million on average, which the average punter can't afford. So there's this sort of commercial feasibility handbrake on unlocking more supply.
What we've also seen is there's been a gradual and steady reportage of businesses that are involved in construction collapsing and basically going out of business, which doesn't necessarily help
No, and that's what
find a way of building things. You've got to you've got a need for new housing stock. Um, the people that might build it are out of business because of whatever reasons happen to exist, and you're in a situation where you might need to import some skills in certain areas because you may not have enough
hmm,
skills in that space. Is this a perfect storm for people, Terry?
yes, there's not much going right for the supply of housing at the moment. So you kind of flag those big ramp up in the collapse in construction businesses, and these were people who kind of got caught out by the construction price increase. So they signed a fixed price contract saying, I'm the builder, Tom, I'll build you a house for $500,000. And I thought it would cost me $450 to build, but costs go up 30%, so it's going to actually cost me 800,000, but I've got to charge you 500,000. So there's that challenge there. And then there's also kind of the financing part of things as well. The banks, we have a higher interest rate environment now than we did 2 or 3 years ago. So developers might be keen to actually build something, but banks are more conservative about lending because they're like, oh, I've picked up the newspaper. I see there's a spate of collapses in the construction industry. I'm going to be a bit more focused in on some of the parameters of your project. I want more pre-sales. I want you to put more capital in, which once again kind of draws capacity away from the development sector. And then you've had sort of developers who have gone through a tough time financially over the past 3 or 4 years in the new building space. They're kind of shifting their focus not from constructing new housing, but actually doing knockdown rebuilds or renovations. And you can kind of see some suburbs as maybe 20 houses constructed over a period of time, but there's no net addition to the housing stock. It's just people coming in going, here's an old house. I'm going to knock it down and build a new house. So there's no additional adding of supply, but it's keeping builders and tradies and materials occupied away from building a net addition to the stock.
One of the things that people occasionally talk about and is the decline in the skill set over a period of time in terms of builders, plumbers, and whatever else. Everybody got into sending people to university because,
Mm-hmm.
you know, bookworms were the thing, right? Um, Is there a valid argument in looking at ways of getting people um, more involved in vocational training as opposed to your standard tertiary education to be able to, yeah, have more people capable of doing the work that's needed?
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of things happening in there. For a long time, people in that tertiary, the TAFE sector would lament that they were sort of a little bit out of fashion compared to the university pathway. So there's people who might
Yeah.
have in the past naturally gone on to be a electrician or a carpenter. They were sort of drawn off to the university sector. So there was that kind of challenge, but also there was sort of some logistical challenges for people coming through that apprenticeship pathways in terms of very low wages. You're sort of locked into an employer for a time, which sort of even the people who were choosing to go down the vocational route, they were like, oh God, I only get paid pittance for the first X numbers of my career. I'm going to drop out of that and go do something else. So there's a couple of sort of the attractiveness of the sector. There's also the wages for those young apprentices is kind of a barrier as well. So I think those various levers have sort of been discussed and talked about. And the other kind of thing, back to sort of the renovation part of the story, some analysis we did of the ABS state account data kind of showed that in Sydney and in New South Wales and Victoria, sort of like 40 or so percent of all the expenditure on housing construction was going into renovations or knockdown rebuilds. So there's a lot of tradies who are out there knocking in nails and doing electrical work who aren't adding to that stock. And this is where the sort of the planning controls become important to say part of the reason why some people are knocking down a house and building another one is that the planning controls might not permit them from building even two townhouses on that site. So once again, if we start to give people the choice going, oh, my house is a bit old, I'd like a new one, I'm just going to knock down rebuild, or with the planning controls, I can actually knock down the house, build two townhouses, live in one, and sell the one off. So it's about how do we kind of sort of shift some of those decisions to get some of those tradies who are in short supply focused on building new stock, not just knocking down rebuilding.
What, and I guess this is kind of a broad question on the topic, but um, outside of what we've spoken about up to this point, are there other challenges you foresee for the pugilists that are going into the next election campaign in this particular policy space?
And probably the biggest challenge in the housing space is that the lead times are very long. So in other policy areas, you can make a change to legislation on the 1st of July and things change. Whereas in the housing sector, making changes takes time. So even if you sort of go through and let's say we can rezone all this land on the 1st of July, developers will go, okay, I don't own any land in this particular area, so I have to go purchase it, which might take them 6 months. And then it might take them 6 months to a year to kind of go through the design process, the planning process to get an approval. And then it might take them 18 months to complete the project. So we're really talking about any interventions which come through the pipeline from a policy or planning perspective, taking 2 or 3 years before it sort of hits the ground with new houses coming available. So we really are in a very tight spot at the moment.
But to what you're saying is you've got from the acquisition of land to the initial planning and design to then getting it all signed off, you've got, you know, you better hope the business is going to be around for the length of time it actually takes to get the sucker approved.
Exactly, and this is where we're in one of the other things that's gone against us in the housing market is when COVID came along and the pandemic hit and we had border closures,
Yep.
we had no international migration. So there was a period there where builders were like, no new people. There's no point me trying to build additional housing. Some of them pivoted into that renovation market. and we're still kind of got a little bit of the hangover from that uh, no migration or uncertainty about how much migration there will be because people weren't thinking about more people coming to the country, hence we've got to build more houses. So part of the problem right now is that sort of 2 or 3 years ago when we had closed borders or migration was just opening and people didn't realize how many people would return, how quickly they would return to Australia. So that's another challenge that we're facing as of 2025.
Now, Cherry, that's covered a lot of territory in a short space of time. If people want to know more about your thinking or KPMG's thinking in this area specifically, housing, the marketplace and housing policy, where do they go?
Yep. So our website is a treasure trove of whether it's sort of short and sharp pieces of analysis about households of Gen X and Gen Y and what they're doing. Whether it's on number of houses which are kind of stuck in the pipeline of planning approvals, and then there's sort of also longer sort of thought leadership pieces where we might kind of delve into the complicated issues in more places. So the KPMG Australia website's a good place to trawl. You can follow me on LinkedIn as well. That's another good spot to find more about the thinking that's going on.
Terry, thank you so much for your time. There's a lot in what you've said, and there will be more said about the policy areas as we get closer to the election. So thank you.
Tom, I really appreciate your time. And as I just described, we could come back in 2028 and almost have the same conversation about the housing market.
Do you want to diarise it now?
Yeah, we'll put it in maybe after Australia Day in 2028, we can find a time.
And of course, well, you viewers, thank you for joining me again for a slightly modified edition of Ravlic at Large. Given that the tech didn't quite want to work the way we normally do. So stay tuned, and we'll be back, and I'll be back for another episode of Ravlic at Large fairly shortly.